Ladies and gentlemen, fantastic to have you all here. It's a very interesting time for education at the moment and very challenging, and the amount of work and effort and time that people have been putting in to try and get it right for the children has been phenomenal. And what we want to do here is try and bring in the expertise. Let's look a bit to the future, a bit to the longer term, and see where we can go. I'm just absolutely delighted to have Professor John Hattie, or John as we'll call him today, on with us from Australia. We've been looking at what the research is saying out there in terms of where we should be heading. We've been studying what the papers are saying, because there's been places here before that we've been through where crises have happened and schooling's been affected, and what outcome we can hope for from that. And what we're going to do is run through that with you today and use John's expertise. So welcome, John, and fantastic to have everyone with us, and particularly you, John.
Yeah, it's great to be here, Stephen, and great to talk to those that are on the line today.
Great. So what we're going to do is just kick straight into it. You've got a chance to ask questions. We'll have the chat on, and we'll try and include those in there. We're going to go through three kind of phases with this. The first phase we're going to look at is, okay, so what's the overview of the situation? What's the kind of research telling us? What are the stories out there? How believable are they? And what's likely to come out of it? The second one, obviously having John here, will be to move on to the learning process and what the implications are for the learning process for the future and how we move that forward. And then the third one, we're going to look really to that longer term. What should school leaders, teachers be trying to think about? And then we're going to end with some takeaway messages, so they're really clear for you. And that's the way we're going to run it, if that sounds okay. So I'm just going to start, John. John, what have you learned so far from this?
Well, I think starting with where you started, Stephen, is the incredible amount of expertise and work that teachers have put in. If you said, I'm going to do an experiment where I'm going to close schools in a week, you're going to have to remodel how you teach dramatically. You're not going to have kids in front of you. And then I'm going to say to you 7 or 10 weeks later, now you're going to go back and half of them are there and half of them are not. You wouldn't get ethics approval. It wouldn't happen, but it has happened. And I think if we look at the evidence that we see, not just from this COVID situation, but from previous situations like this, we have to give a lot of credit to the teachers and the school leaders as to what they've done to minimise the damage. Pretty impressive, actually.
It's been stunning to watch it. So just pulling that one in, because I know there was where we work on that one. So in some ways what you're saying there is we've had this incredible experiment, which is just unfolding as we're going along now. So just out of the experiment itself, what would you say then would be the key bits that are starting to emerge from that in terms of doing different?
I think we've got a lot more to learn, and this is going to keep us busy for the next few years understanding what happened in this unnatural experiment. I think that one of the things that worries me about the whole thing is if you look at previous pandemics, previous earthquakes, hurricanes, you name it, the sad thing is we rush back to the old normal very, very quickly, and we miss the opportunity to learn what has worked very well in the COVID experiment to bring back. Now, don't get me wrong, not everything has been wonderful. There have been problems. There are kids that are missing out. But overall, as the 80-20 rule applies here, about 80% of the kids, teachers have done a stunning job to keep them on track, to put them in a situation where they are not going to be dramatic losers. And in many cases, there's going to be a lot of winners.
Okay, so I thought it'd be quite useful we've talked a lot about the new normal. It occurs a lot of times. I mean, I put a few thoughts. There's a really good paper out today by Michael Fullen through the Pearson group, which is worth having a look at. But it was just kind of, well, what does this new normal look like? And I think, here's a kind of summary of what you were saying, and I've nicked this off your slides. Thank you very much, John. Just to say that with this presentation, it was heavily oversubscribed. So what we're going to do is run it again on Monday at 4 o'clock if people are wanting to get more detail. At that time, we'll release all these slides and the overview presentation as well, so you can share it with colleagues. So you really are getting we're getting this firsthand. But this was a kind of slide that you showed, John, just to summarise kind of what the teacher positive aspects were, the student positive aspects, and the parent positive aspects. Are there any bits you'd like to kind of bring attention to there that were kind of more unexpected than others?
Well, this was a survey of around 6,000 parents, teachers, and students over the last few weeks, and there's some common themes there. I think one of the common themes across all is, in our jargon word, we call it self-regulation. Those kids who have high levels of self-regulation are the ones that have done very well through this period. Those students who are very dependent on their teachers don't do so well. And so you can see there that there's quite a lot of kids that have good levels of self-regulations. They want to work at their own pace. They like the fact that they don't have to do the travel. They can have a lot more ownership over when they do the work. And certainly we know from, I'm sure this is in Michael Fullen's report from his deep pedagogies, as we do from our visible learning, because we develop those kids, those attributes in kids, we're less likely to see them going backwards during this 10 weeks. If anything, they're going forwards. And many of them don't want to return to the old normal. They don't want to return to the distractions. Some kids who are very distracted in the class are saying things like, I'm not as distracted at home, but I still get the work done, and it's being done to a sufficient level. And I think that's some of the things we should learn from this, is that, do we really have to have all those kids in front of us every minute of the day where teachers talk 89% of the time? It's about facts. I'm not sure we do. And this is the message that's coming out here from both teachers, students and parents.
Yeah, it's something that we're seeing here, that you kind of, the way schools are designed, almost designed the way learning takes place in them. So the classroom becomes a group of 30 kids, and an hour becomes a block, because it stops the transition periods and the loss of learning during those. But yeah, it seems that we've actually brought all our knowledge of what learning is on, but we aren't really able to apply it in quite the same way. But I mean, obviously there's a lot further we can go on that one. So just picking that one a little bit further apart, if you like, we were just looking at what this new normal might be, and I picked these ones off Michael's slide. So obviously safety is going to come in there really strong and live. We then got this kind of process within the academic learning. What's that new normal now going to look like? We then move on to what he calls independent study skills, but I know you're called learning strategies, and move into that in a lot more detail, and we'll get into that in the slide, particularly in the second part. We're then looking at this whole assessment continuity and rigor, which I know is becoming problematical for teachers, because the way we used to assess isn't quite so easy to do when you're moving across the kind of triage between learning online, learning in school partially, and also then homeschooling. And then we've got this kind of parents carer skills gap, that where we're having to outsource quite a lot into the parents to be able to do that. And then lastly, this kind of well-being area between children, and also particularly amongst staff. And I think the anxiety levels, or certainly what we were hearing about, was the anxiety levels amongst some staff will then have repercussions for students. And it's not a kind of evenness about this, it's going to move around. So is there anything you would add to that new normal?
Well, I think the other part of the new normal, if we get our act together, is like here in, I live in Melbourne, Australia, and today the students all went back to school for the first time. You could hear the collective sigh from many parents. I think parents have realised that there is expertise. In fact, I had a reporter called me 2 days ago that has kids in school, and she said, I didn't even know there was a thing called pedagogy. I didn't know there were skills teachers had. I thought it was about discipline and getting them to do the work. I didn't realise there were skills in discipline and getting them to work. And I think we need to take this as an opportunity to esteem the expertise of teachers. In fact, here I've got agreement from some ministers and some director generals to put up teachers for Australians of the Year. Now, they will compete with nurses, I know, but I think this is one of the other big learnings we take from this. Going back to Michael's list, parents have learned more than anything else about the language of learning. And that, I think, is quite a stunning achievement. We've always focused with parents in the policy space about things, buildings, schools, types of schools, money, curriculum. No one focuses on learning. We tend to think it's teachers. But I think the parents have learned that schooling today is about learning. Learning's not easy. Learning's hard work. And I think that's a really good thing about the way we can think moving forward about how we can engage parents in the learning lives of their students. I think that's a real positive, and we can get that right.
Right, thanks. So moving on then, we move on to this kind of notion, which I know you've been playing around with for a while and really developing now into what this grammar of schooling looks like at the moment and what it could look like, which is kind of exciting. And it's certainly not something that's on the agenda particularly strongly in England and other parts of the world. So please, I'll share that one with people so they can see it. Would you like to give us a bit of detail on that?
Well, Bell and Lancaster in England started up the monitorial system in the 1850s, and this is a photo from that period. And I'm sure if that teacher came back today, 150 years later, she could walk into a class, she could talk a lot, she could ask lots of questions about facts, she could go through that list, and she'd be very comfortable. As an ex-music teacher, the only thing she'd probably notice difference is there's be no piano in the room like there is behind her right now. And so, and don't get me wrong, it's worked for about 80% of the kids. This system works. It's an industrial model, and it has worked for many kids. In fact, it's worse than that, Stephen. There's a conspiracy. Kids above the average want teachers to talk more, want more about the facts, want to be engaged in doing things because they're good at it and they do very well at it. The question we have to ask is, should we be running a system for 80% of the kids? No. And that's why I don't want to abandon what's worked very well. I want to take what's happened in this last COVID experience and build that in to see if we can engage more kids in learning. Like if you ask my granddaughter, who's 4, does she want to go to school? She is holding out, you cannot believe it, 95 to 99% of kids at age 5 want to go to school to learn. By the end of primary school, it dips to the low 40s, low 30s actually. It goes up slightly in high school. That's too many kids not turned on to this thing called learning. And so how can we use some of the experiences of the last 10 weeks to add to this grammar of schooling to bring a new way of doing schooling? And this is the new norm. I don't want to throw it away. I want to build on it and make it better.
So, right, so Build Back Better, very much the theme of where we're going here. That's actually the United Nations response to a crisis. So we haven't stolen it from anyone. It is the right way to go. And I think there's been some really interesting ideas in that as to what a fragile response might look like, what a robust response may look like, and what an anti-fragile response may look like. And I realised that anti-fragile word's kind of fairly new, comes from Nassim Taleb and his work. And what he was saying there was basically, if we're a fragile response, I think that's fairly obvious where we're looking at to there. A robust response is all about hanging on to what we've already got and what we perceive to be working. And then the anti-fragile being, okay, well, this is an experiment, this is an experience. What can it look like now based on the learning? So how can we build back better so they fit in very strongly within that? So let's just look a little bit at the moment at learning loss, because I think this is something on an awful lot of teachers' minds. What's your take on learning loss at the moment?
Well, it's about 10 weeks. And if you look at all the research, if you look at the summer vacation effect, and the effect size is close to 0, the length of summer mustn't matter, modified school calendars doesn't matter. It's very hard to see whether 10 weeks is going to make much difference. And you got to remember, we actually didn't lose 10 weeks. We still did teaching in that 10 weeks. And so even those figures, probably even closer to 0. For most kids, there will not be a negative reaction. Now, I'm going to be careful, and I know we're going to come back to this. Some kids there will be, and we need to be very clear about that. But in general, no. I don't expect that the research is going to show that going out of schooling for 10 weeks, going out of classes as we know them, and to in school, in home classes, is going to make much difference. All the evidence says no.
So, I mean, I know you for those who like a bit more of a statistical representation, I think you've done a lovely job here in showing the effect of less than 10 weeks less of schooling on countries around the world.
Well, take Australia, that's where I'm standing in at the moment. It has the longest school day, the longest school year of any OECD country. And if we reduce our schooling by 10 weeks to the blue line there, you can see the green arrow countries still exceed us in the Pisa, the Pearls, the Tim Stakes. It's not the amount of time we have, it's what we do with it. And I'm sure in the UK too, take away 10 weeks, teachers are incredibly robust at using the time they have to get through what they need to. Now, of course, they're going to argue for more time, but we're going to be careful that we ask for more time and do the same old stuff. We're not going to make and get the dividends. And so once again, when you look at the research, and I know there's groups coming out, I know EFF have in England, I know there are groups here in Australia, saying, oh, kids are going to lose so much learning and it's going to increase the equity gap. That assumes nothing happened in those 10 weeks, which is not true. That assumes that learning is linear and straight, not true. That is assuming that teachers aren't very good at adjusting what they need to do to the time they have. No, the effect isn't going to be very great. There are things we have to worry about, but it's not that.
So that's quite a relief, I know, and certainly that when we look a little bit more detail about what happened within Christchurch, in particular with the earthquake and within Hurricane Katrina, we'll see that, but we'll get onto those in a little bit, just trying to get that overall feel. And the next area we move on to is technology, which I know is kind of one of the areas that you've looked at, and we've been forced onto technology. I think it's been painful. There was a recent study came out that said 50% of teachers really did not like using technology in this kind of this manner, and didn't feel they had the skills or the confidence to be able to do it. But we're here, it's here now, and I know you'll have something to say about that one. So please let the people know what your thoughts are and where the research is heading.
Well, there's over 200 meta-analyses on technology that since 1977, and as Dylan Williams says, it's the revolution that's still coming. The effect sizes are quite small, and mainly because teachers have used technology to kind of replicate what they're doing already. One of the most exciting things that I think is in the technology area is the use of social media. And we have seen that over the last 10 weeks. And I hope that teachers who have suddenly had to learn some of those skills, like one of the things that happens in social technology is teachers are much more involved in triage at the moment with the students. One of the interesting parts that we've looked at in our own work is learning as a function of not knowing, and agreeing that you don't come to school to learn that which you already know. So how do we make an environment in class where it's okay not to know? And we know that for many kids by age 8, if they don't know, they learn to look like they do and don't put their hand up. How do we get kids in an environment where they're prepared to talk about what they don't know, they talk about their errors and mistakes, and do it in a safe way? Social media is very, very powerful for that. Kids, even adults, are much more ready to write in social media about their thinking, about where they're struggling, and you'll have seen that dramatically over the last 10 weeks. And we've seen it in our research. We can increase the amount of area acknowledgement, we can have more gradual release of responsibility for the students, and we can monitor their processes. And I think that's, I would hope, is the most exciting thing that teachers have seen. And I'd be asking them is, how can they bring that kind of use of social technology back into the classroom? It's been tainted with all those issues with cell phones in class and Facebook and all those things. But if we get over that for a moment and say, that technology's there now. Kids are very adept at using it. We can use that in our classes. We don't physically have to have all those kids in front of us every minute of the day. They can be throughout the school, working in groups on the technology. And I'm sure, as the teachers have seen, and you saw from that survey that's been done in Australia, much more one-on-one. Teachers have more time to teach in these circumstances. We're using the social technologies, and that's what I asked them to think about. I want every teacher to think about what worked well over the last 10 weeks. Write it down, wait a few weeks, and bring it out. I know the reason I'm asking for wait a few weeks, there's a lot of work to get kids back into this place called school, and let's hope we don't forget some of that learning about the social technology.
Yeah, and I think that modeling's so interesting. I was talking to Mark Burns, a colleague who you know, and he said his daughter's dance school, they shut it down immediately because obviously they can't have the contact. So the kids all just whizzed on and started teaching each other dance moves. So they usually have 50, they had 40 turning up online, and suddenly the teachers would go queuing into it and watching what was happening and went, whoa, some of this is a bit risky and we need to step in and kind of do it. But other bits, wow, they've already got all that sitting in there and they're working that way. So it's quite a movement on, yeah.
Yep. We talk about kids not having resilience. I think we've seen more resilience than you'll ever believe over these last 10 weeks. We underestimate that they are very good at wanting and able to be their own teachers, of course, along with the experts.
Nice one. So just as a kind of reflection at this point, because I'm aware good learning is just about throwing lots of things out, I'm going to nick one of your slides here. So it's a recall the teacher of most positive impact on you and when you were at school and why. So just give you 30 seconds there at home, or in your school or in your setting, just have a little think about that. Who were those teachers who had that positive impact? And really crucially, why was that so impactful on you? It's a great one to do with all your staff and your teams while you're at school.
And a few years ago, Stephen, we had an occurrence where we got data from quite a few hundreds, if not 1,000 adults, where this question was asked and the why. And we got the data, did the analysis, and it was really fascinating. And my question to those of you who answered that question right now is, firstly, most people can remember 0, 1, or 2. You had about 50, so it's about 4% that we remember at best. And then when you ask the why, it's 2 reasons. Either that teacher turned you on to their passion, and or that teacher saw something in you you may not have seen in yourself. And what's fascinating about this question is this is who we remember, not because they were maths or English or phys ed or panel beating teachers, but because they turned us on to learning. And I think that's the thing that's been, we saw in many cases over the last 10 weeks. That's what we see in many of the classes around the world that are in the old normal, the old grammar of schooling. Those teachers can turn kids onto a passion. And I'm sure all of us as parents just dream that our kids are turned on to some passion, hopefully desirable and socially worthwhile, of course. But that notion of high expectations, and it comes through the visible learning work, it comes through here. And I think this is where teachers who are able to spend time turning their kids on to the passion and having that side of learning as well as the achievement side is so important. And I think that's what has happened with the kind of interactions that teachers have had with kids through the social media over the last 10 weeks.
Yeah, it really shows up, you know, what's possible and how important those relationships are. Now, just looking through the questions, a lot of them now relate more onto pedagogy, onto learning. So we're naturally moving on to that part anyway. So it'd be really interesting, obviously, with colleagues that whether that was what you connected with. And I think remembering that as soon as we go back in, that it's our passion that we go.
And for me, that's Mr. Tomlinson, my maths teacher. And so I ask you that I do every couple of years, I write to him. I make contact with him. For me, it was 40 odd, 50 years ago, but make a contact. Tell that teacher that they had that kind of impact on you. It's part of esteeming our profession.
Fabulous. Nice. A nice warm human message within there as well. So where are we going to look for then if we're going to start, if you like, to look at the learning element? So if we're focusing on the learning process, are we onto the practice, are we onto the platforms, are we onto the processes, are we onto the practice of learning? What's your thoughts on, John? Where would you start your focus on learning, particularly as we now moving out of this kind of hybrid emergency area to something approaching a recall back to school?
Well, Stephen, out there at the moment, there are so many platforms, learning management systems, there's so many apps, and for good and bad, many of them are about the management of learning or about the surface level learning, the chance to replicate and to lots of consolidation, and there's nothing wrong with those. That is not necessarily the best use of these technologies. As we've been saying, it's this notion of which you can hear kids thinking more. You can be more involved in giving the formative evaluation as they're doing things. You can put kids in groups in social media and how that can be used as an extra in the regular classrooms when we come back. I think it's remembering that we're using the technology to teach. We're not using the technology to replace us with some of these other tools. Nothing wrong with consolidation, but that's why the effect has been very small. But how can we use these assets that we have to bring in this notion of learning, to hear how kids are learning, to get them to think aloud, to get them to think aloud with their colleagues, to get that communication and dialogue going. Like if you go back to the study that we did in England a few years ago, quite a number of teachers, about 18,000 teachers, and one question we asked amongst many was, how much of the lesson does a teacher talk? 89%. Now, we have a situation where kids come to school to watch teachers work. We want to turn that on its head and we want more dialogue. And I know having discussions and dialogue isn't always the easiest thing to set up because kids often teach each other the wrong stuff. But through the social media, you can see when it's right, when it's wrong, you can structure things. And how do you build that collective efficacy, that belief and confidence of working in groups? Because that's what the employers are asking of us. We want graduates who can work in teams, who have social skills and have the precious knowledge. That's what we need to bring back to the new normal.
So if I can throw back in with that one, which is very helpful, which is I know you've been doing some work recently on student collective efficacy. I think many of our audience will be familiar with collective efficacy as a construct and how it works, and the truly impressive research data that shows. But how does that work in a student sense? Because this might offer some clues as to how we get back.
Well, yeah, I'm working with Shirley Clark from England and a couple of other colleagues from America on the notion of student collective efficacy. And it's about three things, Stephen. It's about teaching the skills of working in groups. It's teaching them the confidence that they can work in a group. And the hardest one is teaching them the confidence that the group could come up with a better decision than they can. And I'm sure, like me, Stephen, I know you well and you know me well. Sometimes it's quicker to do it ourselves. That is not conducive to teamwork. And to be really good in teamwork, you have to have very high levels of social sensitivity. And I'm sure, as we're seeing in America at the moment, your country and mine, the ability to respect yourself and respect others is a pretty critical thing in our democratic society. That's part of the skills of collective efficacy. So we see that whilst it's one of the most powerful things for teachers, school leaders, also the case with students. And as with many cases over the last 10 weeks where students are being able to work together, I think some pretty impressive things happen, but we've also learned the kind of skills that we need to develop in these students so that they can be more effective at working in teams.
Right, well, we're going to get right into what those skills might be, but I'm just going to move on or come slightly back onto the technology aspect, because obviously that's where we're sitting at the moment and we do need to have a look at it. So I think this was a nice quote that you particularly like.
Yes, I do. It's been coming a long time. It's, as I said, we're not optimizing the social interaction aspects. We do tend to talk at students, but the idea is how do we learn with them? How do we constantly continue to do that formative evaluation of checking for understanding, listening to the feedback from the students about their learning and therefore about the impact that we're having on them. And it's getting that balance right. And we've spent a lot of time in our work saying that we want kids to know things. We want precious knowledge, and we want deep thinking, and we want them to transfer it. And at the moment, the previous use of online has tended to favour the knowledge side and not the deep thinking. And I think it's a mistake to go for one or the other. I want both. And we have to be a bit more systematic in ensuring that before they go into the deep thinking, before they go into the problem-based learning, the inquiry, they've got sufficient knowledge to go in. Otherwise, the kids who don't have that knowledge go into problem-based learning and are the biggest losers. It's that balance. And I think we can do a lot better at getting that balance right.
Yeah, I think I've been spending the last couple of years, well, the last 16 years, looking for a platform that could actually support online learning. And I mean, the learning element rather than just organise the knowledge and get people to engage. And one thing that's becoming really clear to me is you've got the technology people on the one side, and then you've got the learning design people on the other. And I think there's a bit of a disconnect where we've been building stuff between those two. And the more we can traverse that gap between those who understand technology and really understand what an evaluative model based around learning is, and then you can start to move this forward. As you said, moving away from just trying to replace the teaching role and what we do so well, and to actually be that supplement and catch the collective.
Well, if I could be naughty, Stephen, most learning designers I've met know nothing about learning or design, and they keep thinking that their job is to replace the teacher. What's happened over the last 10 weeks, the teacher has been front and centre in that technology. And I think it's how we support the teachers to use this resource around them rather than replacing them is where we're going to get the biggest dividend.
Yeah, and that's going to be quite a change in thinking about how we use technology. So exciting.
Yeah, it is.
But challenging as well, which is always good.
But getting the right questions on the table, that's what matters.
Yeah. So Fulham was suggesting, in terms of what we're looking at, a few people have been asking this, what does it look like when we go back? We're obviously moving from this online level to when then learners are coming back into school, online or homeschooling or whatever it is, back to there. And he was suggesting a number of steps, and I wonder which ones you'd affirm and not, because obviously Michael has a certain way of looking at things. things. The first one is to make it an invitation that learners are coming back into the classroom, so they feel like they're invited and that their needs are taken care of when we get there, rather than just jumping straight into learning and being worried about that learning loss immediately. And the second one was he's talking about to defront the classroom. So because learners have now got used to this more spaced move where you want to drop stuff when you're not concentrating, move into it a bit later. Third one is talking about that collaboration, which we've already been working on. Fourth one, choice. And the fifth one is finding the individual support and where people need that support because they may have gone there. So how do you feel about that in terms of the steps for getting back to full classroom learning?
Well, one of the areas of research that I've been working in for 30 years is school shooting. Strange area, but it is. We have a colleague, we have a group, we have a pretty large sample size of adolescents in prison. We're looking at this, and one of the interesting things that happens after a school shooting is about the notion of how do we help the kids reclaim their space? And that's what Michael's talking about, I think, when he talks about the infighting and the invite and the defronting. How do we reclaim the space? How do we listen to the experiences that the students have been through, some good, some not so good, and how do we invite them back to this place called learning? The mistake is to create it as it was and not listen to the students in terms of what worked for them. The notion, as you said, that they want to space their lessons out, their learning out in different ways, how we can take away this frontal teacher up the front. I think some schools are going to struggle with that, but I'd ask you in the first few weeks to worry about that. The other thing is Maurice Galton, I think, did the most powerful study about when kids change schools, change classes, in the Oracle study in England a few years ago. And one of the things he found is that one of the biggest predictors of success was if the students make a friend in the first month. That social aspect. School can be incredibly lonely. And when you've been at home by yourself 10 weeks alone, in many senses, from your friends, coming back can be a little traumatic. So that friendship notion, we should worry about that in the first part of that inviting back, that claiming. And I'm sure Michael will agree with me. Schools should always be inviting places for kids to learn. And that needs to be highlighted.
Cool. Now, for some students, obviously that's not going to be possible. I mean, we're seeing sort of between 40 and 70% return to the classes that are available. I know my daughter at the moment we have to socially distance, so she can't go back into school and may not be able to in September. And I know the data on distance learning isn't particularly strong. Obviously, this comes from your own research. I wonder if you can help schools a little bit with this. And there is obviously a variance in this, as with any effect size, as to what really produces high effect sizes. So if we are stuck within distance learning with certainly high proportions of our students, where do we go?
Well, no, Stephen, not quite. This is strong research. Very confident with this. 21 meta-analyses, 7 million kids, effect size 0.17. What it's saying is it doesn't matter whether it's distance or in class. If anything, distance does slightly better than in class. And it's the old story like time in class we talked about before. It's what you do that matters. It's not the medium that matters. So this is not saying distance learning is a failure. It's saying relative to in class, nothing in it.
Okay.
That's what you do.
Very reassuring then. And then if we look at what happens obviously within the earthquakes, you put this teacher triaging trumps. I'm sure you're not referring to Donald, the Donald himself, but
I was living in New Zealand at the time of the two major earthquakes. They then followed that with about 15,000 earthquakes over the next few years, and there was a number of schools that literally disappeared, were just gone in the area. And at the time, I was an advisor on the New Zealand Qualifications Authority, which oversaw the major exams like the A and the O levels in your language. And everyone was arguing that we have to give the Christchurch students dispensation. They've lost their schools. They had to go online. It wasn't the same. And so I put a bottle of red wine on the table and said, we should do nothing. And I made the claim we should do nothing by looking at, as we're going to look at at the moment, the hurricanes, teacher strikes, all these kind of things. And my argument was the kids will actually do better. And they did. They did better in the year of the earthquakes. And then as the schools started to go back to normal, their performance went down again. And the reason for that is that teachers went into a triage notion. They went to the students on the online and said, Stephen, What are you knowing? What aren't you understanding? How can I help you? As opposed to, come to my class, sit there, and I'll tell you all what you need to know. And this notion of triaging is very, very powerful. It's the essence of formative evaluation. It's the essence of teacher clarity. It means I have to do a lot of good diagnosis with you to understand what you can, you can't do, where you need to go next, and who you're going to go next with. And this is the big message that I hope that many have seen over the last 10 weeks that we need to bring back. It's not true that every kid walks in the class, it's the same stuff. And using the kind of technologies that we've seen over the last 10 weeks, we can be very sensitive to that, which is why I'm saying that triaging is quite a successful method.
So what we're seeing a lot in this evidence is obviously using triaging, but I think there's also this kind of notion of adaptive resilience, which seems to create a bounce back. And certainly, I think I talked in an earlier webinar about if it's done individually, the bounce back and the adaptive resilience is good, it's worth having. But if you do it collectively, it starts to get stronger. And if you involve the whole community, it gets even stronger still. Have you got any kind of reflections of that from your experience within those notions of?
Well, yeah. If you go back to the slide, you'll see in the hurricanes and the Katrina one, the effect size from 10 to 12 weeks away, hardly at all. You look at the Canadian study I'm using, where we looked at teacher strikes, where teachers went out on strikes and compared the performance of their kids compared to kids that weren't on teacher strikes, virtually nothing. Now, I'm not arguing teachers shouldn't go on strike. I'm not arguing that any of that kind of stuff. I'm arguing that the nature of the length of time, the nature of these kind of disasters, that resilience, that ability to bounce back, that gradual release of responsibility, that moving to triaging, that focusing on what students. One thing, Stephen, in this business, never underestimate the willingness, the adaptivity, and the effort that teachers are prepared to put in to help their students, no matter what. That's what's coming through here. That passion we talked about.
Worth it, certainly. So if we move on to the parents then, because and there was a lovely piece that I know that you shared with me from Tasmania, saying that there's 4 major roles within teaching. One is the preconditions to get kids in the right place. The second one is obviously the curriculum and delivery. Third one, the learning processes and how we activate those. And that fourth one then being the wraparound and the interventions and everything to keep it moving. And what it was basically saying is the concentration seems to be on the curriculum and delivery from the school level response, and almost letting the parents do the other the other 3 areas, and even some of the curriculum, because you can't get the curriculum unless you've got the technology switched on, and that puts a lot of emphasis on the parents. So just wondering what your thought is within the parents, and what do we know about parenting in terms of, and I mean I'll share this slide because it kind of starts to answer a few of those.
Well, what I'd love to see happen as a consequence of this 10 weeks is we stop thinking of parents as the homework police. We stop thinking of as the person we report to once or twice a year about their performance. We did a study where we took school reports from 300 schools, and on the basis of that, 98% of people in this country, of kids in this country, are achieving well, putting in an effort, and a pleasure to teach. That lie is believed by no one. And I think what we've seen over the last 10 weeks is that we can engage parents understanding what learning is. Many parents have realised they don't have the expertise. I had a reporter ring me last week about her, telling me about her 5-year-old. And she said, the first thing I realised, she said, I didn't even know there was a thing called pedagogy. She said, I was asked my kid to count to 30 and then count backwards. And I got my 5-year-old to count to 30, and she did. And I said, now go backwards. And she looked at me as if I was off the planet. I said, 29, 28, 27. And the kid said, so what's going on? So she said, I said it slower and louder. And she said, I don't have a clue what to do. I said, well, teachers have these skills. They know about the notion and the concept of backwards. They probably put them in tasks, unlike counting the numbers to blah, blah. My point in that story was, I think we have a lot more ways in which we can engage parents in the learning. I hope not a single parent in the world ever asked their kid at the tea table at night, what did you do today? Because that is reifying that whole notion of the doing. And in a lot of doing, there isn't much learning. I hope they ask about the learning they did today, about the struggle as a good word, about the nature of the feedback they got. I think we can involve parents in understanding that learning in today's schools is quite different to what it was when they were there 10, 20, 30 years ago. Very healthy.
I just go on that feedback with parents. I mean, I did it with my own daughter and asked her for a year while all my children got this, the Hattie treatment, if you like. What feedback did you get today? And boy, did you have to be persistent, because they wanted to talk about what they did, or not really talk about what they did. And they really resented that churning back of the feedback, and yet the feedback seems to be the most important bit. It was interesting. One of the other things I've noticed is success criteria seem to have kind of disappeared with the online learning bit, almost. Now, I know that's not going to be true in all schools, but it's just what I'm seeing. And we've actually built that kind of language of learning around them, and then suddenly they disappear off. And if you haven't got success criteria, obviously the feedback becomes that much more difficult.
Well, when you go online and you're not there and they're not in front of you all the time, the notion of teacher clarity becomes even more critical. The notion of showing kids up front what success looks like, so they don't go off on tangents where you spend half your time bringing them back and they get frustrated because they wasted their time. So if we're not seeing success criteria, we're not seeing formative evaluation, and we're not seeing a lot of teacher clarity, I think we've got a pretty bad situation on the online system.
Okay, so there's a quick 3 then for everyone to sort of take away. If we can get those ones nailed, then at least we're moving forward. Let's get into a little bit more detail now, because I know one of the other areas is obviously this whole issue around how you develop learners and what the absolute crucial ingredients. Now, obviously, I haven't worked with you for a while. I'm kind of pretty clear on that. I mean, can we just talk about learner expectations? Because I think this is something that everyone's been aware that teachers having high expectations of learners is really important. Yeah, it was only when I got really into your work that I understood, no, it's not as important as parental expectations and learner expectations themselves. Can you elicit a little bit more of how we can work with those learner expectations to get better performance and outcome?
Yeah. Going back to Mr. Tomlinson, teachers with high expectations tend to have it for all the kids and are very successful. Teachers who have low expectations tend to have it for all the kids, and unfortunately, they're also successful in the wrong way. But just as critical is understanding what the students' expectations are. What degree of challenge are they prepared to take? What prepared of risk they take? Remember, this is where they start. We want to set the challenge using the Goldilocks principle of not too hard, not too easy, not too boring, and then help them get to that success criteria. This is one of the reasons why we're so obsessed about showing them success criteria and diagnosis. And then it's a matter of closing that gap between where they started and where they need to go. And I'm sure we use the parallel of a lot of video games. They follow that kind of procedure. They know what your prior achievement is, your last level. They know what the success criteria. But they don't say, oh, you did your best. No, and they don't say when the student gets to that success criteria, they don't say, oh, well done, good work, go out and play. No, they raise up. And this notion of knowing what the expectations are on the students, and the aim of education surely is never to meet the expectations of the students. It's to raise the expectations of the students. And I think that's the most powerful notion that we can have, to say to kids, no, you're not a C student. You can get to be a B student, and I can help you get there, and I'm very good at it.
So moving that conversation away from what are we doing, more to, well, where do you want to get to? I'm really unpicking that.
And that's great teaching. It's seeing things in kids they can't see, that don't think they can do it themselves. Taking them out of their comfort area, getting them into the growth line.
Cool. So I know a lot of the work you've been talking about recently is about kids developing their own learning strategies. And it'd be really useful to hear that more direct from you rather than me championing that course, which I'm with. Talk to us about what those learning strategies are within themselves, where they come from, and then how you can actually develop those as teachers.
Well, what we did in a nutshell, Stephen, was we looked at about 400 different learning strategies to try and work out which were the most optimum. And it turned out that there are a small group that are very optimal, but it depends when. If you're learning surface level knowledge, then the skills of outlining and organizing. The one set of skills that we're not as good as teaching is we then have to move on to consolidation through spaced practice, to deliberate practice, to seeking feedback, to practice testing, which we kind of don't like very much, but they are very important strategies for kids to overlearn so they can then go on and apply that content knowledge to the deeper relational ones, where this is where the whole notion of self-regulation, self-assessment comes into play, and then to consolidate that, self-verbalization, self-explanations, talking aloud, and then moving on to transfer. And so there are a smaller set of strategies we need. And one thing that I would argue we know quite a lot about is kids who have only one strategy don't do as well. You don't need 10 or 15 strategies. You just need, if the first one doesn't work, you'll need some alternative strategy to come in. And that's this whole notion of self-regulation and the jargon. How do we help kids know when the strategy is working, know when it's not, and have another one? Pretty important stuff.
So in terms of those strategies, they're already innate within the individual students then?
Well, I don't think they're innate. They learn them, but some, unfortunately, learn some and then keep applying them even when they don't apply, and then say, I can't do it. And no, I think we can teach these strategies along with the knowledge. We need both.
So that'd be really important. Cool. And then another element you talk about is assessment capability. It'd be great if you could just kind of explain that in a nutshell and how that can fit into this new land as well.
We're trying to get a language here that's really critical. It's not student control over learning. That's not what we're talking about. If I ask you to play canasta, Stephen, you've never played it before, and I say, you're in control of your learning, away you go, I think I know what you would do. Nothing. It is giving kids the skills of knowing what to do when they don't know what to do, giving them the skills of understanding what success criteria looks like and help them understand the steps to get there. It's helping them interpret. Like when you get an assessment back, I hope the kids have been taught how to interpret that assessment and ask the question, so now what do I do next? Not, oh, I got a grade, put it away. And so this whole notion of making them assessment capable, it's the key to this notion of self-regulation. And the kids who have those skills, I would argue, would have done very well over the last 10 weeks.
Fab. And the last one I'm just going to emphasize is the feedback process, because I know this is an area where you've done so much investigation work with basically everyone in the world is concerned about feedback. So what model would you use with the pupils given this situation for the teachers to use, but and then encourage the parents to use?
Well, you know, feedback is very powerful, but it's also extremely variable. A third of feedback can be negative. And that variability is what we've been working on over the last 10 or 20 years. And I think the thing that we have to remember, and the time I've got here tonight, is it's less about the feedback you give, and it's more about the feedback you receive. So as teachers, and I think this is what we would have seen in the social media over the last 10 weeks, we have to understand, has the student listened to the feedback? Have they understood it? And can they action it? And those are really critical dimensions. So often we assume that if feedback's given, students understand it. It's just not true. Most of us know, and I know this as a husband, when I get feedback, it costs. I have to do it again. It wasn't right. It's a lot easier, Stephen, to be a selective listener. And a lot of our 8-year-olds learn that very quickly. If you don't hear the feedback, you can just move on to the next thing. And so teaching kids this notion of how they receive, interpret, and action feedback, which means we as teachers have to be a lot more adept at listening to kids and not talking.
So I've seen some brilliant examples of that, and I've seen some disastrous examples in this. And it really does throw away that old notion of setting work and then marking it and thinking that's feedback really isn't going to cut any mustard in whatsoever in terms of learning gain, if that's where we're heading. Yeah. If we just move on a little bit to the kind of notion of learner voice within this, because I know this is something else which is kind of slightly confusing. And I know when we did the visible learning research in England, we turned out to be the worst country in the world at listening to learner voice. Yes, we've got these kind of committees on student councils and stuff like that, but this isn't learner voice. Do you want to kind of elucidate what you mean by learner voice? And this might help a bit.
It's learner voice about the learning. It's about the learning. It's about getting kids, like the irony with visible learning is that learning more often than not, is not visible. And the reason I chose that title is I want to make it more visible. I want teachers to see that learning through the eyes of the students in the same way I want students to be more adept at being their own teachers of that learning. And so when I hear student voice, I cringe because it's so often misinterpreted. Kids talking for the sake of talking. No, I want that student voice to be about their talking. Most of us as adults don't have a very good language for how we learn. And I ask you on this session today, how do you go about learning? Most of us would struggle with a language. Well, if that's the core business we're in classrooms, we have to get better with that language. And that's why I think student voice about learning is critical.
So it's how we get it, how we develop one that's a shared. And I think this is one of the things that's come through really strongly, because I know one of the bits you said that there was coming out of the research that the actual learning loss was more related towards nutrition, potentially, and lack of nutrition, lack of learning space. But the third one was having that language of learning and the shared language of learning. So now, interestingly, there was a little bit of data that I was looking on recently, which I think this is the problem of perceptions as well, that 51% of teachers thought they had really good relationships with their students. But when they asked the same students the question, only 34%, I think that was in Michael Fullan's research, thought that they had strong relationships with the teachers. And then there's this difficulty of the kind of rose-tinted spectacles which we view the world to feel good about ourselves, starts to kind of inform us. So we think we're doing these things, but we're not really doing those things. So how do we check on those learning things to make sure that they're really happening?
Exactly that, Stephen. You check for understanding. You listen to the students and you make it a safe environment where they can talk about these things. And it's not just the relationships you have with the students, it's how you build the relationships between the students. That's as critical, because that's what often they judge how you are as a teacher, how safe it is in that classroom.
Cool. So I know you're a big fan of peer and social learning. You know, what is it? What lessons are there in this, in terms of how we can take that forward, particularly as we return? I know we touched on it a little bit, but what, you know, if there was one thing that you would say take away for schools, what would that be?
I think it's about how we construct success criteria that includes peer and social learning. Too often the success criteria is only about the work focused on the individual student. We ask the students to sit in groups and work alone. We ask them to do assessments where they usually get their feedback alone. How do we get a constructive alignment between teaching the students how to work in pairs and in groups, in teams, build up those skills so that it can add to their value and make them certainly more employable down the line? The old days where we're in it by ourselves, not true. Employers realise at age 18, if the kids don't have those kind of social skills to work in groups, it's too hard to teach them that. If they don't have sufficient knowledge, they can adjust for that. And so there is a lot more pressure on us to do that. So we need to see that in our exam systems, our curricula, and the tasks we give kids. Not all the time, but part of the time, how we build that peer and social learning, because that's what's demanded of us. And this is where a lot of kids really will struggle. And we've seen some of them struggle over the last 10 weeks. Those kids who don't know how to work with others. It is a very lonely activity over those last 10 weeks, and they're amongst our biggest losers in this COVID experiment, sadly.
So one of the areas, John, is that, you know, you're one of the few professors in the world who really does put his backside on the line, if you like, and goes out there with the work and says, this is the way it is. And the visible learning schools, I'm just wondering how they've fared in this. What's the story from, you know, has visible learning worked with schools to get them through these sorts of areas?
Well, obviously, I'm monitoring that quite closely, Stephen, and the answer is an emphatic yes. Those schools who have been developing assessment-capable learners, the whole visible learning notion, they have found that this period of time has actually had some bonuses for them. Now, again, let's be careful. Not every single kid, but the vast majority they have, because the very things we're talking about, that's what we develop in our visible learning implementation model. How do you make students their own teachers? How do you give them those skills, self-regulation, give them different strategies? How do you get them to understand and get the teachers to have that massive clarity that we want, that helps kids know what they're aiming for and work with us to get there? So no, I'm very happy about what I'm seeing in that space.
Good. And just to throw this one out, because obviously this is one that you work with a lot in success. Are there any factors that kind of work well in the blue? Because I think what we're seeing here is obviously where teachers do a phenomenal job, particularly when they can control all the environment and the circumstances around learning. Suddenly without this, it's much more difficult to control. Are there any of those factors, because you always talk about the blue zone and the yellow zone, that have changed and you've seen that kind of move over and said, yeah, the yellow actually becomes the blue in this circumstance, or the blue becomes the yellow? Or does the research seem to hold up?
No, it holds up. No, not at all. And that's what, going back to the earlier discussion, the media doesn't really matter. And we've got to remember that using the distance learning, the blended learning, there are opportunities there to bring back to the new normal some of those good attributes. You don't have to do everything through distance, but you don't have to have everything with the kids in front of you all the time. So no changes there.
And in the other side of it, which, and we won't play the guesswork game here, we'll just give it to people. These were the ones with the lower effect size. Nothing changed on those as well?
Not at all. They're the same structural things. They really make very little difference. Yeah, it's nice having them, but look at the size of those effects to compare to the ones we want. They're pretty small and trivial.
I guess the reduced class size is now going to show itself off in its full
Well,
glory.
no, you've got to remember what's happened here, Stephen, is that teachers have got the same amount of kids, but they've interacted with them differently. And many of the kids are saying, as we saw in that earlier survey, I got more one-on-one time with the teacher in the same class size.
So that may alter things then, or may help if we got it right. Yeah. Okay, cool. Moving on to the next bit then. I think one of these areas was the new vulnerable that we were looking at. I'll go past that. Which students are most likely to be impacted? And I know that's a kind of small slide for those looking on smaller screens and stuff like that, but do you want to emphasize? So the new vulnerable, what we're saying here is basically the ones who we naturally recognise as being vulnerable and having learning difficulties. There's a new group emerging in this.
Well, yeah, we've got to be very careful. I get a bit frustrated here as I've been hearing many people say, oh, it's going to increase the amount of disadvantaged kids. We're going to worry about those in the disadvantaged groups. And yes, we do. But we've got to be really careful. Some of those kids have done very well. Like the number of parents who have contacted me with kids that have autism, they have done extremely well getting rid of some of the distractions from the regular classrooms. And they're saying, why can't they be more involved in this kind of way of learning when we go back to the new normal? And so let's be careful about automatic classifications. And if you look down that list of what I think are the top 10 groups of kids that are impacted, that concept of self-regulation, that loneliness comes out. And my major message here, diagnose, don't assume. Don't assume that disadvantaged kids are necessarily worse off and that advantaged kids are necessarily not worse off. Well, that's first part of the reboost as they come back into the school over the first few weeks. Be very attentive. Like we did one study a few years ago where we asked the question, how many kids in any one day in a classroom does no one speak to? 1 in 5. Now, schools can be lonely places. Can you imagine? Some kids come to school because it's a safe haven. Home is not a safe haven. We're going to be very attentive to those kids. And so as we go back to the new normal, drop your categories for a moment and say, hey, all these kids have gone through this experience, all of them for the first time. Let's be attentive to every kid in terms of making a friend, the social self, their well-being, their achievement, their progress. There's concepts themselves as a learner. And let's do really good diagnosis so that we're very careful that we do identify the kids that may need the boost, that may need the extra help. Don't assume. Diagnose.
Cool. And then if we're looking at school leaders then in terms of teaching school leader expertise, this is what you'd be saying, yeah, let's cling on to and let's make sure we emphasize these and build these as our rock, yeah?
And the thing I'll add from the COVID experiment, and this is not true only for teachers and school leaders, every one of those is true for the kids too.
Yeah. So that's a nice list to take away. As I say, this is going to be available from Monday for you to use, and you can make your notes. But these are familiar from John's work anyway, so we're working through those. So, is it time for a rethink now? New models of education?
Look, I'm pleading with everyone I can. I plead to everyone on this session today. Make a list of the things that have worked well. As a student, as a parent, as a teacher, as a school leader. One school I'm working with, quite a few schools, they're getting their teachers to write a one-pager. They're putting them together. Many schools have published them on their website. We're having a statewide symposium here in Victoria. New South Wales is having an inquiry. What can we learn from this? And I hope, as I said before, in 4 months' time, let's come back and look at that list and say, what can we build into the new normal? The worst thing that can happen from COVID is nothing. The worst thing is we can go back to the old normal. It's not working for too many kids, enough kids. And there are some really good things we've learned from this. And we may have to invest in different kinds of professional learning for our teachers to do this. We may have to invest in the time and effort to make some of these things work. I think it's well worth it. This is our best chance. Let's not make this unnatural experiment a waste of time. Wow, please, everyone, make a list, share them, put a companion. We here in Australia on our weights and websites created a Facebook stage. Every parent teacher can come on and put their ideas. We want to bring those out. Lest we forget.
Yeah, because I think everyone went into this, it was very difficult to baseline, and then they've been all iterating their process. So getting back to the evaluation becomes difficult. I know you offered a slight scale here. Is that useful in this?
Well, it is about knowing our impact, and I think we can know our impact in different ways through this last 10 weeks that I want to take. Now, obviously, if you're going to add and create a new normal, you have to get rid of stuff. I think teachers have been very good at getting rid of stuff over the last 10 weeks, and I think most teachers have really enjoyed the notion that they have spent more time in teaching. Yes, I just can't appreciate and imagine the amount of workload that they've had to add to this with often no great acknowledgement, which is very sad. But this notion of bring back teaching, let's get away from these debates about curriculum and structures and schools and assessments and these things, and let's focus back to good old teaching.
And I think to bring back one of your favourites, the Jenkins curve.
This scares me. Again, my grandchild, she's going to go in. 95% of kids in K1 to 2 want to come to school to learn. End of primary school, start of secondary, gets down to 37 kids want to be there. 1 in 4 kids want to be there. 1 in 3 kids at best. Oh, this is the curve that should be on every principal's secret wall somewhere. And we have to improve better than that. You said it yourself, Stephen, earlier. Schools must be inviting places for kids to learn. That is the ultimate criteria to get them to come back to this place called school and invite them to learn.
So I'm just going to be slightly controversial as we get right towards the end here, which is the EEF have come out in the last couple of days in England, obviously, and said that somewhere between an 11 and 75% widening of the achievement gap. That's obviously a huge range, and they put various caveats on top of those figures as well. So it kind of, I'm just wondering what your feel is on the achievement gap, whether that's a thing of focus, but also they've talked about one-to-one tuition and summer schools, which I know are kind of well within your research, though.
You could drive a London bus through those numbers. And having seen the report, I'm sorry, it missed the point. They should have talked about the things that we had to do during the COVID and what the effects of those are. And they did a lot of studies based, and I've seen that report, based on what happened in normal classrooms. Like one-on-one tuition, that is not going to be the answer. As we've talked constantly, continually through this session, it's how we work in groups of kids, how we triage, how we go through these notions, and how to get that notion of what the ways of thinking has been and how it's been optimized in this last 10 weeks. That's nowhere in the report. They've gone straight back to structural solutions. And it's the same as others who have talked about the increasing achievement gap because of COVID. That's not necessarily true, and it underestimates the skills of teachers to really do well by their kids. As we've said, I'm not saying every kid is well over this last time. Some kids have, and this is why I'm keen for schools to come back, some kids have disappeared from the system. Some kids haven't even logged on in the 10 weeks that have been out of school. Those kids are real, they do exist. We have to be very attentive to those, yes. But we still have to ask, even for some of those kids who don't do well in the regular classroom, what have we learned from that? And so, no, I'm a bit worried about some of those reports, doom and gloom sayers. I think there's a positive message here that we have to optimize.
Cool. And then I know you put a nice little list of ouchies out there, so I'll share those. Which ones are the ones you're most worried about on that list? We'll share
this is the ones from survey that the students, parents and teachers have said. I think the additional workload for teachers, we have to get smarter about that. And you look down that list, there's nothing in there that we didn't know already that happens in the regular classroom. I think the parents are more worried about the high academic standards and direct supervision than the teachers were. If you match that list up of distractions or ouchies compared to the list we had earlier, it's not a bad list to say, yeah, I can deal with all those. They're fixable.
Okay, so that's good. And it's good to focus on those things from the student angle as well to get that right. And then I think the Build Back Better, the new grammar of schooling then.
Oh, this is some of the things I put to you is happening. Like here in Australia, 27% of all the teachers in teacher education at the moment are doing full online teacher education. I hope, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, I hope that we can actually capitalize on that. Teachers coming into the profession today, they want to work collaboratively. Teachers who've been out there 10 to 20 years, if they're any good, they did it by themselves. It's not sustainable. And I think you've seen a lot of teachers, a lot of schools right across the UK in the last few weeks where we've seen a lot more cooperation amongst teachers. And you see teachers that are more burnt out and struggling are the ones that have had to do it by themselves. I think we've got an opportunity to change the profession and make it more collaborative as part of the new grammar of schooling. It's an exciting time. And I really hope that we do take this opportunity to reinvent, to have debates about what this new grammar of schooling should be.
And I like
COVID. One of the few things we can say thank you to COVID about.
Yeah, And the failures, you know, we're going to meet them. We're going to meet the frustrations head on and stuff like that, and take a deep breath and say, yeah, what did we learn there? Because if we can't model that learning, then it's very difficult for others. Hey, John, that's been absolutely fantastic to have you on, to be able to share that level of expertise with everyone. Really appreciate it. And thanks for everyone joining us. You've piled in loads of questions, people. That's fantastic. What we'll do is we'll be collating those, and we'll get kind of answers to those as much as we can. As I say, we'll release this one very shortly. We have a new series out called Build Back Better. That's available on the Osiris website, featuring various experts from education, where they'll be delivering over a three webinar period to give real expertise for staff. That will be available over the summer, so people can feel really properly prepared in all areas. And the great thing we're really pleased to announce is John wrote a paper a little while ago, and we turned it into a program, and that's going to be ready on Monday, and that's going to be free to all schools, and it's on the new Osiris digital platform. So you'll be able to see that and download that and share that with your teachers, and it goes right through from teacher expertise into looking at the parenting and looking at these messages. But what it really neatly does is profiles everyone at the beginning, because a lot of people don't like being seen to be wrong and don't like this vulnerability that they're feeling. So let's understand what that vulnerability really is, and then we'll work with them on it. So I mean, many thanks for John's time on that. You'll all hear about that as we move forward. Any closing remarks, John, before we sign off?
It's a pleasure, as always, talking with you, Stephen. Thanks for inviting me.
Well, thanks so much for your time, and thanks for everyone else for joining us as well. And, you know, keep up the good work. You're doing great stuff out there, but do think long term. There's some really real potential learning to come here for the whole system. Thank you, John.